Rocky Mountain National Park is systematically hunting its visitors. Park employees are vanishing, wildlife attacks in coordinated groups, and something ancient is erasing all evidence of human presence. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been a wildlife ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park for 8 years. I specialize in large mammal behavior, elk, moose, the occasional mountain lion. I'm trained to track, observe, and understand how animals move through these mountains. What I encountered last October in Glacier Gorge wasn't any animal I'd studied, but it understood us better than we understood ourselves. The reports started trickling in during the 3rd week of September. Hikers on the Mills Lake Trail claiming they heard their own voices calling to them from the canyon walls. Always the same pattern. They'd be hiking alone or with a small group, and they'd hear what sounded like their own voice shouting their name from across the gorge or from higher up on the cliff face where no human could possibly be. At first, we dismissed it. Echo effects in narrow canyons can be strange, especially when you're tired and your mind starts playing tricks. The gorge between Alberta Falls and Mills Lake is particularly notorious for acoustic anomalies. Sound bounces off the granite walls in ways that can make a simple hello seem to come from 3 different directions. But the reports kept coming, and they were getting more specific. Sarah Kim, a 34-year-old photographer from Denver, filed the first detailed incident report. She'd been hiking alone to Jewel Lake for sunrise shots when she heard her own voice calling Sarah, "Sarah, over here," from somewhere high above the trail. She looked up and saw nothing but sheer rock face and scattered pine. When she called back, "Hello," her actual echo returned normal, a simple delayed repetition, but the voice that had called her name never echoed back. 2 days later, a father and son from Texas reported hearing the father's voice calling the boy's name, "Come here, Jake," from inside what appeared to be a solid rock formation near Ribbon Falls. The father swore he hadn't spoken, and his son had been standing right next to him when they both heard it. My supervisor, Janet, assigned me to investigate. "Probably just acoustic weirdness," she said, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Take a day, hike the trail, see if you notice anything unusual. File a report." I set out early on a Tuesday morning in mid-October. The aspens had already turned, painting the lower elevations in brilliant gold, but above 9,000 feet, winter was already setting in. There's something about that transitional period, when the mountains are caught between seasons, that makes everything feel unsettled. The first few miles of the trail were routine. I knew every switchback, every stream crossing, every boulder field. I'd hiked this route hundreds of times for wildlife surveys. The familiar rhythm of boots on packed earth, the gradual burn in my calves as the elevation increased, the steady sound of Glacier Creek cutting through the valley below. It was all exactly as it should be. But as I approached Alberta Falls, something felt different. The sound was wrong, not absent, wrong. The creek was running at normal autumn levels, but its voice seemed muffled, as if someone had wrapped the entire gorge in thick blankets. My own footsteps, usually crisp and clear on the rocky trail, sounded flat and distant. Even my breathing seemed to disappear into the canyon walls instead of bouncing back as a subtle echo. I stopped at the falls to rest and take notes. Alberta Falls isn't dramatic by Colorado standards, maybe 15 feet of water tumbling over granite shelves, but the acoustics are usually excellent. Hikers love to shout and hear their voices boom back from the narrow canyon walls. I called out a simple, "Hello," nothing, not even a whisper of echo. The sound just died, as if the air itself had swallowed it. I tried again, louder. "Hello." This time, I heard something that made my skin crawl. About 3 seconds after my shout died away, I heard my own voice call back, "Hello, Marcus." It knew my name. My voice, unmistakably my voice, had called my name from somewhere high above the falls, where the canyon walls rose 200 feet of unclimbable granite. I looked up, scanning the rock face through my binoculars. Nothing, not even a bird, just gray stone and patches of ice where morning shadow lingered. Just acoustic weirdness, I muttered to myself. But my hands were shaking as I wrote in my field notebook. I continued up the trail toward Mills Lake, but every step felt like I was walking deeper into something that was paying very close attention to me. The normal sounds of the forest, wind and pine needles, the distant chatter of pikas, the creak of tree branches, were all muffled, as if the gorge was holding its breath. About a mile above the falls, I heard my mother's voice. "Marcus, honey, where are you?" I stopped dead on the trail. My mother lived in San Francisco. She'd never been to Colorado, and she'd been dead for 3 years. The voice came from my left, from the direction of a narrow side canyon that led nowhere but sheer cliff faces. It sounded exactly like her. The slight accent from her childhood in Taiwan, the way she always made my name sound like a question when she was worried. "Marcus, are you lost, sweetheart? My training kicked in. Document everything." I pulled out my recorder and started speaking in a low, steady voice. 10:47 a.m. Approximately 1.2 miles above Alberta Falls. Hearing voice mimicry of deceased family member. Voice appears to be coming from side canyon to trail west. Coordinates. I rattled off the GPS numbers, but my voice was tight with fear. "Marcus, why won't you answer me?" The voice was getting closer, not moving along the canyon floor. That would be impossible given the terrain, but somehow approaching through the rock itself, as if something was crawling through the granite like water. I started walking faster. The trail switchbacked up through a grove of stunted firs, and with each turn, I heard more voices. My own voice calling out coordinates. My college roommate asking if I wanted to grab dinner. My ex-girlfriend saying my name the way she used to when she was falling asleep. All of them coming from the rock. All of them perfectly mimicked. All of them wrong. By the time I reached Mills Lake, I was practically running. The lake sits in a cirque surrounded by towering peaks. Long's Peak, Mount Lady Washington, Keyboard of the Winds. On a normal day, it's one of the most beautiful spots in the park. That day, it felt like an amphitheater designed for something hungry. The lake was perfectly still. No wind ripples, no fish jumping, no movement at all. Just black water reflecting the granite walls around it like a mirror. I sat on a boulder at the lake's edge to catch my breath and review my notes. That's when I heard the conversation. Two voices, both unmistakably mine, talking to each other from opposite sides of the lake. "Did you see anything unusual?" the first voice asked. "Nothing yet," the second voice replied. "But something's watching." "From where?" "The water. It's been watching from the water." I looked down at the lake's surface. My own reflection stared back, but it was wrong. The reflection's mouth was moving, but I wasn't speaking. The reflection smiled. I ran. I don't remember much of the hike down. Just boots pounding on stone, my own panicked breathing, and the sound of my voice calling after me from a dozen different directions, asking me to wait, telling me I was going the wrong way, begging me not to leave. When I finally reached the trailhead parking lot, my truck felt like a sanctuary. I sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked, writing my report with shaking hands. But as I wrote, I realized the most disturbing part wasn't what I'd heard. It was what I remembered hearing myself say, because I did remember. Somehow, I remembered being the voice that called from the rock. I remembered watching myself hike the trail from impossible vantage points. I remembered the hunger, the desperate need to draw someone closer, to make them step off the trail and into the places where the canyon walls narrowed to nothing. I submitted my report recommending immediate closure of the Glacier Gorge trail system. Janet read it twice, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Marcus," she said carefully, "we can't close a major trail system based on acoustic anomalies." "It's not acoustic anomalies," I said. "Something in those canyons is collecting voices, learning them, using them. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Have you heard from Dr. Patricia Vance? She was doing sound ecology research in the same area last week." I hadn't. Dr. Vance was a researcher from UC Boulder who'd been studying natural soundscapes in the park. She'd been granted permits for extended backcountry work in the Glacier Gorge area. We tried calling her satellite phone. No response. Her research station at Mills Lake showed no sign of recent activity. The search and rescue team found her equipment 3 days later, scattered along the shore of the lake. Her notebooks, her recording devices, her camping gear, all of it arranged in a neat line along the water's edge, as if she'd simply walked into the lake and vanished. But we never found Patricia. What we found instead, when we played back her research recordings, was hours and hours of her own voice calling out from the canyon walls, saying her name, asking herself questions, having conversations with herself from impossible distances. The last recording was different. It was Patricia's voice, clear and steady, speaking directly into the microphone. "If you're listening to this, don't come looking for me. The echoes here aren't echoes. They're invitations, and once you accept one, once you answer back, you become part of what's calling." There was a pause, then her voice again, but this time it sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I can see you listening. I can see you wondering if this is real. It is. And now, I can see you thinking about coming here yourself, just to prove it's not." The recording ended there. We closed the Glacier Gorge trail system the next day, citing geological instability. The closure is still in effect, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, rangers at the Beaver Meadows station report hearing voices calling from the direction of Mills Lake. Patricia's voice, my voice, and sometimes voices they recognize but can't quite place. I transferred to a different park 6 months later, but I still wake up sometimes, hearing my own voice calling my name from just outside my bedroom window. And I know that somewhere in those granite canyons, something is still waiting for the next hiker to call back. Listen to me very carefully. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in narrow canyons, and you hear your own voice calling from the rock, don't answer. Don't even acknowledge that you heard it. Because the moment you respond, the moment you try to have a conversation with yourself, you become part of something that's been learning human voices for longer than these mountains have had names. And trust me, you don't want to learn what it plans to do with all those voices it's collected. Subscribe, like, stay safe, or ignore it and see what follows you home.
My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and I've been the Chief Medical Officer for Rocky Mountain National Park for 6 years. I've treated everything from broken ankles to heart attacks, from hypothermia to lightning strikes. I thought I understood mountain medicine. I was wrong. What I discovered last summer at 11,000 feet taught me that some things that live at altitude aren't content to just survive in thin air. They feed on it. And on us. It started in June with what seemed like a routine case of severe altitude sickness. Trail Ridge Road had just opened for the season after winter snow clearing, and tourists were flooding up to the Alpine Visitor Center like they do every year. Most handle the elevation reasonably well, but we always get a few cases of acute mountain sickness, headaches, nausea, dizziness. Standard treatment, standard recovery. But Thomas Brennan wasn't standard. He was a 28-year-old marathon runner from sea level, Miami. Excellent cardiovascular health, no respiratory issues, no medications. The kind of person who usually adapts to altitude better than most. His wife brought him to my clinic at the Kawaniche Visitor Center in a state of complete panic. He just stopped breathing, she kept saying. Not like he was choking or struggling. He just stopped, like he forgot how. Thomas was conscious but barely responsive. His oxygen saturation was 89%, low, but not critically dangerous at that elevation. His pulse was steady, blood pressure normal, pupils reactive. By every measurable standard, he should have been uncomfortable but functional. Instead, he sat on my examination table, staring at nothing, taking shallow, irregular breaths, like his body had forgotten the rhythm of respiration. "Thomas," I said, shining my penlight into his eyes, "can you tell me what happened?" He looked at me with the strangest expression, like he was trying to remember something important. "It was drinking," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been screaming. At the top, something was drinking my breath. His wife, Sarah, squeezed his hand. We were at the Alpine Visitor Center, just taking pictures of the view. Tommy started acting weird, like he was dizzy, so we sat down on one of the benches outside, and then his breathing got slower and slower until it almost stopped. I administered supplemental oxygen and observed him for 2 hours. His saturation improved to 95%, but his breathing remained eerily shallow. When I asked him to take a deep breath, he looked terrified. "I can't," he said. "It'll know I'm trying to take it back." I discharged him with instructions to descend immediately and return to sea level. They left that afternoon. I thought that would be the end of it. 3 days later, Jennifer Walsh, a 45-year-old hiking guide from Boulder, presented with identical symptoms. She'd been leading a group along the Ute Trail, a high-altitude trail that follows Trail Ridge Road above the tree line, around 800 feet. She'd started experiencing what she described as reverse breathing. "It felt like something was inhaling when I was trying to exhale," she explained, "like there was another set of lungs connected to mine, but breathing opposite. Every time I tried to breathe in, something else was breathing out through me. Same symptoms, same vacant stare, same terrified reluctance to breathe deeply." By the end of June, I had 7 cases, all at elevations above 0 feet, all describing variations of the same experience, something interfering with their breathing, something taking their air. I started keeping detailed records. Age range 22 to 58, mix of locals and tourists, various fitness levels, no common medical history. The only consistent factor was altitude exposure above the tree line, and they all described feeling watched. "There's something up there that notices when you're struggling to breathe," said Michael Torres, a 33-year-old photographer who'd been shooting sunrise from the Alpine Visitor Center when it happened to him. "It can smell your weakness, and once it finds you." He couldn't finish the sentence. Dr. Janet Morrison, my supervisor, was initially skeptical. "Elena, you're describing a cluster of altitude sickness cases. That's not unusual for summer season at elevation." But the symptoms weren't consistent with any form of altitude sickness I knew. These patients weren't improving with descent and oxygen. Some of them were still experiencing breathing difficulties weeks later at sea level. And there was something else, something I didn't include in my official reports. They were all losing weight, not from nausea or loss of appetite. They were eating normally, maintaining their usual routines, but their metabolic rates had increased dramatically, as if their bodies were working harder to maintain basic functions, as if something was taking more than just their breath. In July, I decided to investigate personally. I drove up Trail Ridge Road before dawn on a Tuesday, planning to spend the day at various high elevation locations, monitoring my own physiological responses. and taking environmental readings. The road climbs from 500 feet at the park boundary to over 0 feet at its highest point. I'd driven it hundreds of times, but never with this kind of focused attention. The ascent felt different that morning. Not the usual gradual adjustment to thinner air, but something more active, like the atmosphere itself was becoming aware of my presence. At 0 feet, I stopped at an overlook to check my pulse oximeter and take notes. Oxygen saturation 92%, normal for the elevation. Pulse slightly elevated, but within expected range. But something felt wrong with my breathing. Not difficult, wrong. Each inhalation felt like it was being measured, evaluated, like invisible lungs were testing the air I drew in, deciding how much I would be allowed to keep. At 0 feet, the sensation became unmistakable. I was sharing my breath with something else. Every time I inhaled, I could feel a secondary draw on the air, something else pulling oxygen from my lungs before it could reach my bloodstream. Not painful, not violent, but persistent. Like a gentle, continuous suction that grew stronger the higher I climbed. I pulled over at the Alpine Visitor Center parking lot and sat in my truck, trying to analyze what was happening. My pulse oximeter showed 88%, lower than it should be for someone acclimated to altitude work. But more disturbing was the pattern of my breathing. I wasn't controlling it anymore. Something else was setting the rhythm. Deep breath in, pause. Shallow breath out. Deep breath in, longer pause. Barely perceptible exhalation. My body was breathing according to something else's needs, not mine. I grabbed my emergency oxygen kit from the back of the truck and put the mask over my face. The supplemental oxygen helped, but I could still feel that secondary draw, that sense of sharing each breath with an invisible presence that was taking more than its fair share. That's when I saw them, high above the visitor center, maybe 200 feet up the slope of Mount Ida. Shapes were moving against the sky. At first, I thought they were birds, large birds riding the thermals that rise from the sun-warmed rocks. But birds don't move like that. These shapes pulsed, expanded, and contracted with a rhythm that matched my compromised breathing, like enormous lungs made of shadow, inflating and deflating against the blue sky. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the nearest shape. It wasn't solid. It was more like a distortion in the air, a heat shimmer that moved with purpose. But I could see its form clearly, a pair of lung-like sacs connected by what looked like branching airways, all of it translucent but visible against the bright sky. As I watched, the thing descended slowly toward the parking lot, its breathing sacs expanding and contracting, and with each contraction, I felt the air pulled more forcefully from my lungs. Other shapes followed, dozens of them, drifting down the mountainside like jellyfish through water, all pulsing in the same rhythm, all breathing. I started my truck and began driving down the mountain as fast as the winding road would allow. But with each switchback, each 100 feet of descent, I could feel more of them settling onto my truck like invisible nets. My breathing became shallower. My vision started to tunnel. The pulse oximeter dropped to 85%, then 82%. At 500 feet, I pulled over and stumbled out of the truck, gasping. The parking area was empty, except for a single RV with Colorado plates. I could see an elderly man sitting in a folding chair beside it, but he wasn't moving. His chest rose and fell in the same unnatural rhythm I was experiencing. I walked toward him, fighting for each breath. "Sir, are you okay?" He looked at me with the same vacant expression I'd seen in all my patients. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" he whispered, looking up at the sky, like watching the mountain breathe. Above us, the translucent shapes continued their descent, their lung sacs pulsing faster now. I could see more of them emerging from crevices in the rock face, unfolding like parachutes made of living air. The old man's breathing stopped, not labored, not struggling, just stopped. His eyes remained open, still watching the sky with wonder. And in the silence, I could hear it clearly, the sound of dozens of invisible lungs inflating and deflating around us. I ran back to my truck and drove straight down to 90 feet before stopping. Only then did my breathing return to normal. Only then could I draw a full breath without feeling something else drawing from it. I filed my report that evening, recommending immediate closure of all Trail Ridge Road facilities above 11 feet. I cited atmospheric anomalies creating respiratory distress. The recommendation was denied. Tourist season, Elena. We can't close our most popular attraction based on a few altitude sickness cases. But I kept monitoring. Through July and August, 17 more cases, all the same symptoms, all above 11 feet, and all of them describing the same thing, something breathing through them, taking what it needed, leaving them with just enough air to survive. The elderly man from the RV was found 3 days later, Harold Vinson, 73, from Grand Junction. Cause of death, respiratory failure. The autopsy showed his lungs were completely healthy, fully functional. He'd simply stopped breathing. His widow said he'd been talking about going back to watch the mountain breathe every day since their visit to Trail Ridge Road. In September, after the first snow closed the highest elevations, the cases stopped. Whatever lives up there in the thin air retreats when winter comes. But I know it's still there, waiting. I've transferred to a park at sea level, but sometimes, when I'm treating patients with breathing problems, I find myself listening for that secondary rhythm, that pulse of invisible lungs somewhere just out of sight. And I remember what Harold Vinson said right before his breathing stopped. They're not taking our air, they're sharing theirs, and theirs is so much older. Here's what you need to understand. If you visit Trail Ridge Road above 11 feet, pay attention to your breathing. If it starts to feel shared, if you sense something else drawing from each breath you take, get to lower elevation immediately. Don't stop to rest. Don't stop to admire the view. Don't let yourself become fascinated by the way the air seems to move against the sky, because what lives in that thin air has been breathing long before there were lungs to breathe with. And once it decides you're interesting, once it begins to share its ancient respiration with yours, you'll discover that some partnerships are impossible to break.
My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been the trail maintenance supervisor for Rocky Mountain National Park for 11 years. I know every culvert, every drainage ditch, every storm pipe in this park. I've crawled through muddy tunnels at 2 a.m. to clear blockages. I've replaced hundreds of feet of corroded pipe, and I've seen what 20 years of freeze-thaw cycles can do to infrastructure. I thought I understood how water moved through these mountains. I was wrong. What I discovered in the drainage systems last fall taught me that something else has been managing our water flow for a very long time, and it's not interested in preventing floods. The problem started in late August with what seemed like routine maintenance issues: culverts backing up along the Bear Lake Road, storm drains overflowing near the Beaver Meadows entrance, mysterious standing water in areas that should have drained naturally. Nothing unusual for end of summer. Monsoon rains can overwhelm our drainage systems, and 20-year-old infrastructure needs constant attention. But the pattern was wrong. The blockages weren't where they should be. Our drainage systems are designed around natural water flow. Storms hit the high peaks. Water runs downhill. We channel it safely under roads and away from facilities. Simple physics. But that August, water was flowing uphill. Not obviously. You had to know the terrain to notice it. But storm runoff was accumulating in places that sat higher than the areas where it was supposed to drain. Pools of standing water were appearing on slopes, while the low-lying collection points were bone dry. My crew chief, Danny Reeves, brought it to my attention during our weekly infrastructure review. "Jake, something screwed up with the drainage along Sprague Lake Trail," he said, pointing to photos on his tablet. "Look at this." The photos showed a section of trail that should have been dry. Instead, there was a pool of water, maybe 10 feet across, sitting in what our surveys showed was the high point of a gentle slope. Meanwhile, the storm drain 50 yards downhill, a drain that should have been overflowing, was empty. "Equipment malfunction?" I asked. Danny shook his head. "I checked the levels twice. That pool is sitting 18 inches higher than the drain inlet. Water doesn't flow uphill, Jake." I grabbed my survey equipment and drove out to Sprague Lake that afternoon. The pool was exactly where Danny had photographed it, a perfect circle of dark water sitting impossibly on the slope, like someone had built an invisible dam. I waded into the center with my measuring stick, 3 feet deep at the center, with edges so perfectly round they looked machine-cut. The bottom was lined with smooth stones that definitely hadn't been there before, stones that looked like they'd been carefully arranged in a spiral pattern. But the strangest part was the movement. The water was flowing, not sitting stagnant like a puddle should, but moving in a slow, clockwise current that made no sense given the location and terrain. I followed the current to its apparent source, a small gap between two of the spiral stones. When I knelt down and looked closer, I could see water bubbling up from below, as if there was a spring feeding the pool. But according to our geological surveys, there was no groundwater at that elevation. The underlying rock was solid granite. I stuck my hand into the gap. The water was moving fast down there, much faster than the gentle circulation on the surface suggested. And it was warm, not hot spring warm, but noticeably warmer than it should have been for late summer. At 400 feet elevation, something brushed against my fingers. I jerked my hand back and looked into the gap. In the dim light filtering through the water, I could see what looked like a pipe, smooth, dark, maybe 6 inches in diameter. But pipes don't pulse, and pipes don't have the texture of skin. I called Danny and had him bring the emergency pump. We needed to drain that pool and see what was underneath. The pump ran for 6 hours and never lowered the water level by more than a few inches. Whatever was feeding the pool from below was replacing water faster than we could remove it. But during those 6 hours of pumping, something interesting happened. Every other drainage problem in that section of the park cleared up. The backed-up culvert on Bear Lake Road started flowing normally. The overflowing storm drain near the Moraine Park Museum emptied. 3 separate standing water issues that had been plaguing us for weeks suddenly resolved themselves, as if something had been forced to redirect its attention to maintaining the pool we were trying to drain. I shut off the pump and watched the water level rise back to its original height within 20 minutes. Then I made a decision that I now realize was the first step into something much larger and more disturbing than a simple drainage problem. I decided to map the connections. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically documented every drainage anomaly in the park, not just the obvious problems, but any place where water flow didn't match our engineering models. Areas where streams seemed to disappear underground only to emerge hundreds of yards away. Spots where our storm drains connected to natural waterways in ways that didn't match the original construction plans. What I found was a secondary drainage system. Hidden beneath our official infrastructure was a network of channels, pipes, and collection points that weren't on any of our maps. They were integrated with our storm drains so seamlessly that they seemed like part of the original design, but they followed completely different routing principles. Our system was designed to move water away from the park as quickly as possible. This other system was designed to collect it. I traced one connection from the Sprague Lake pool down through a series of increasingly larger pipes, pipes that pulsed with that same skin-like texture I'd felt under the water. The network led to a collection chamber buried beneath the Moraine Park Visitor Center that wasn't supposed to exist. The chamber was accessed through a maintenance hatch that had somehow been installed without appearing on any work orders. The cover was heavy, heavier than it should have been for the size, and warm to the touch. I climbed down with my headlamp and found myself in a space that defied everything I knew about our infrastructure. The chamber was enormous, easily 40 feet across and 20 feet deep. The walls were lined with the same pulsing, organic-looking pipes I'd seen in the pool, but these were huge, some of them large enough to walk through. They converged from dozens of different directions, all carrying water that flowed in rhythmic surges like a massive circulatory system. At the center of the chamber was a pool deeper than my light could penetrate. The water was that same unnaturally warm temperature, and it glowed with a faint bioluminescence that pulsed in sync with the flow in the pipes. But the most disturbing part was the sound. It wasn't just the sound of moving water. There was something else, a rhythmic, organic sound like breathing, or like a heartbeat heard through water. And underneath that, barely audible, what sounded like voices. I knelt at the edge of the central pool and listened. The voices were definitely human, but muffled, as if they were coming from very far away or from underwater. I could make out fragments of words, pieces of conversations, what sounded like people calling for help. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it into the deep water. At first, I saw nothing but dark, glowing liquid, but as my eyes adjusted, shapes began to resolve in the depths. They looked like people, dozens of them, suspended in the glowing water at various depths, all motionless, but somehow not dead. Their eyes were open, reflecting my light, and their mouths moved slightly as if they were trying to speak. Air bubbles rose occasionally from their lips, carrying those fragments of voice I'd been hearing. I recognized one of them, Patricia Chen, a hydrologist who'd been working on a stream restoration project near Fall River. She'd disappeared 3 weeks ago. We'd assumed she'd gotten lost in the backcountry, maybe fallen into one of the creeks during the high water. She was 30 feet down in the glowing water, suspended vertically, her field notebook still clutched in one hand. Her eyes tracked my movement, and her mouth opened and closed as if she was trying to warn me about something. I started to climb out of the chamber, but the pulsing pipes had changed. They were contracting and expanding with more force now, and the water level in the central pool was rising rapidly. The voices became louder, more urgent. "Get out!" Patricia's voice echoed up from the depths, distorted but unmistakable. "It knows you're here. It's been waiting for someone who understands the systems." I scrambled up the ladder as warm water began pouring from the convergence pipes. The chamber was filling fast, and the pulsing of the organic conduits was accelerating to an almost frantic pace. I slammed the maintenance hatch and ran, but I couldn't leave Patricia and the others down there. I called my crew and told them we had a major infrastructure emergency that required immediate excavation around the Moraine Park Visitor Center. I couldn't tell them what we were really looking for. They'd have thought I'd lost my mind, so I cited catastrophic foundation damage from undocumented drainage failures. We brought in heavy equipment and started digging. We never found the chamber. According to ground-penetrating radar, there was nothing beneath the visitor center but solid earth and bedrock. The maintenance hatch I'd climbed through was gone, replaced by ordinary concrete. Even the soil around the area showed no signs of recent disturbance. But Patricia Chen was still missing. And over the next month, 2 more park employees disappeared near water features. A trail maintenance worker who'd been clearing debris from a culvert near Lily Lake, and a fisheries biologist who'd been conducting stream surveys in the Kawunesh Valley. Each disappearance was preceded by reports of drainage anomalies in the area, standing water where there shouldn't be any, streams flowing in directions that didn't match the topography, the sound of voices coming from storm drains. I submitted my report recommending immediate inspection of all subsurface water infrastructure in the park. The report was classified as maintenance sensitive, and I was told it would be reviewed by appropriate personnel. That was 6 months ago. I never heard back, but the drainage problems continue. Every few weeks, a new impossible pool appears somewhere in the park. Every few weeks, our storm systems reorganize themselves overnight into configurations that serve purposes I can't understand. And sometimes, late at night when I'm doing emergency repairs on a backed-up culvert, I can hear voices in the water. Patricia's voice, the others, always the same message. Don't follow the flow. Don't try to find where the water goes. It's been collecting more than just runoff. I've put in for a transfer to a different park, somewhere without complex drainage systems, somewhere the water flows downhill like it's supposed to, but I know it's too late. Because last week, I found my own name written in the condensation on my bathroom mirror, and when I wiped it away, I could hear my own voice echoing up from the shower drain, calling my name, asking me to come closer. Let me be very clear about this. If you visit Rocky Mountain National Park and you see standing water where there shouldn't be any, if you hear voices coming from storm drains, if you notice that streams are flowing uphill, don't investigate. Don't try to understand the system. Don't follow the water to see where it goes, because something has been managing the water infrastructure in that park for much longer than humans have been building drainage systems. And it's not interested in preventing floods, it's interested in collecting things. And once you understand how its system works, once you see the connections and follow the flow, you become part of the collection.
My name is Sarah Kim, and I've been a professional wildlife photographer for 12 years. I've shot in Yellowstone, Glacier, the Tetons, and dozens of other wilderness areas, but Rocky Mountain National Park has always been special to me. The light there is different, cleaner somehow, more honest. At least, that's what I used to think. What I discovered last autumn taught me that cameras can capture more than just light, and some things that live in wild places have learned to use photography as a bridge between their world and ours. I first noticed something was wrong with my images in early September. I was reviewing shots from a morning session near Sprague Lake, elk at sunrise, standard wildlife portfolio material, beautiful golden hour lighting, perfect composition, technically flawless captures. But there was something in the background of every shot that I hadn't seen through my viewfinder. In the first image, a majestic bull elk drinking from the lake's edge, there was a shadow in the tree line that seemed too dense, too perfectly human-shaped to be natural. In the second shot, the same elk lifting its head to look directly at my camera, the shadow had moved closer to the water. By the 7th frame in the sequence, the shadow was standing at the lake's edge, just out of focus, but clearly visible as a human figure. I pulled up the raw files and examined them at 100% magnification. The figure was definitely there, tall, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, maybe a long coat or dress. But the strangest part was how it interacted with the light. Everything else in the image cast shadows according to the sun's position, but this figure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I dismissed it as a coincidence. Maybe another photographer had been working the area, and I'd subconsciously captured them in my peripheral vision. It happens more often than people think. The conscious mind focuses on the subject, while the camera records everything in the frame. But when I processed the next batch of images from Bear Lake, the same figure appeared. This time it was much closer to my subject, a family of mountain goats on the rocky slopes above the lake. In the first shot, nothing unusual. In the second, a dark shape among the rocks about 50 yards from the goats. By the 5th frame, The figure was standing directly behind the largest billy, close enough that it should have spooked the animals. The goats showed no awareness of its presence. I started paying closer attention during my shoots. The next morning, I set up at Alberta Falls before dawn, waiting for the light to hit the water just right. I was photographing the falls themselves, long exposure shots to capture the water's movement, when I noticed something in my camera's LCD preview. There was someone standing on the rocks beside the falls. I lowered my camera and looked with my naked eyes. Nobody there, just water and stone and morning shadows. I raised the camera again and checked the LCD. The figure was still there, clearer now. A woman in a long dark dress, standing impossibly on a narrow ledge where no human could maintain balance. She appeared to be looking directly at my camera. I took the shot. When I reviewed the image later, the woman was gone, but in her place was something that made my blood go cold. The rocks where she'd been standing showed a perfect human-shaped void, not a shadow, but an absence, as if someone had used Photoshop to cut a person-shaped hole in reality. That's when I started documenting everything. Over the next 3 weeks, I systematically photographed every major location in the park, paying special attention to the LCD preview during each shoot. The pattern became unmistakable. Entities that were invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible through my camera, were appearing in more and more locations. They seemed drawn to wildlife. Every time I photographed animals, these figures would materialize in the frame, always positioning themselves near, but not quite touching my subjects. A tall man in outdated hiking gear standing behind a grazing elk. A child in old-fashioned clothing crouched beside a family of marmots. An elderly woman sitting on rocks near where bighorn sheep were feeding. They were always dressed in clothing from different time periods, some in what looked like 1800s frontier wear, others in early 20th century hiking clothes, a few in more recent outdoor gear but always slightly off, as if the styles were remembered rather than worn, and they were always watching my camera. But the most disturbing discovery came when I started reviewing older images from my archive, photos I'd taken in the park over the past 5 years, images I'd processed and printed and sold as fine art. When I re-examined them with this new awareness, I found the figures had been there all along, not just in recent shots. In every photograph I'd ever taken in Rocky Mountain National Park, they'd been hiding in plain sight, camouflaged as shadows, rock formations, patches of vegetation. My eye had never noticed them during processing because they looked natural, like part of the landscape. But once I knew what to look for, they were everywhere, hundreds of them, in every single image, and they were moving, not between shots, within the same photograph. I pulled up a landscape shot I'd taken at Dream Lake 2 years ago, an image I'd printed and displayed dozens of times. In the original processed version, there was a small dark shape among the trees that I'd always assumed was a boulder. Now, that shape was clearly a human figure, and it had moved 20 feet closer to the foreground since I'd last looked at the image. I started printing comparison copies of my older work. Same digital file, same printer, same settings. The figures had different positions in each print, as if they were living entities trapped within the photographs, able to move around within the boundaries of each frame. That night, I had a nightmare about something crawling out of one of my prints. I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from my darkroom to my bedroom. The footprints were small, child-sized, and they matched the period shoes I'd noticed on one of the figures in my Bear Lake series. The mud was real, actual earth and organic matter, not some psychological manifestation, and it was still damp. I followed the prints back to my darkroom. Every photograph pinned to my drying lines had been disturbed, not damaged, but rearranged. Images that had been hanging in chronological order were now grouped by location. All the Sprague Lake shots together, all the Alberta Falls images in sequence, all the Dream Lake photographs clustered in one corner, as if someone had been organizing them, sorting them by territory. In the center of my work table was a print I didn't remember making, a portrait shot of the child figure I'd been seeing in multiple locations. She was standing in what looked like the lobby of the Grand Lake Lodge, but the architecture was wrong, older, as if the building was showing its original 1920s configuration. The child was holding a sign written in careful script. "We've been waiting for someone who could see us properly." I grabbed my camera bag and drove straight to Grand Lake Lodge. If these things could somehow manifest through my photographs, I needed to understand the connection before they figured out how to stay in the physical world permanently. The lodge was closed for the season, but I had a key. I'd been hired to do promotional photography for them the previous summer. The building felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, older and more substantial, as if it was remembering previous versions of itself. I set up my camera in the main lobby and started shooting, checking the LCD after each frame. For the first dozen shots, nothing unusual. Then, in the 13th image, they all appeared at once. Dozens of figures filled the lobby. Men, women, children, all in period clothing from different eras. They were arranged as if posing for a group photograph, but their attention was focused on my camera with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took another shot. They had moved closer, another, closer still. I could see their faces clearly now in the camera's display. Not the faces of the dead, but something else. Something that had learned to wear human features like masks. Their eyes were too knowing, too hungry. Their smiles held too many teeth. I started backing toward the exit, still taking photographs. With each shot, they moved closer to the camera's position, not walking, repositioning, like figures in a stop-motion animation. In the final frame before I reached the door, the child figure was close enough that I could see she was holding something in her outstretched hand. It was my business card. I ran to my truck and drove straight out of the park, but it was too late. They had found a way to identify me directly, to connect my physical presence with my camera work. When I got home, every photograph in my studio had changed. The figures were gone from my Rocky Mountain images, but they had appeared in photographs from other locations. Images from Yellowstone, Glacier, Grand Teton. Places I'd worked over the years were now populated with the same entities. They were spreading, using my portfolio as a network to travel between locations, to expand their territory beyond Rocky Mountain National Park. And they were learning. The clothing was updating, becoming more contemporary. The poses were more natural, less obviously supernatural. They were adapting their appearance to blend in better with modern photographs. I destroyed every print, deleted every digital file, formatted every memory card, but it didn't matter. The images existed in too many places: client files, stock photography websites, social media posts, printed publications. They were already out there, embedded in the visual record of every wilderness area I'd ever photographed. 6 months later, I received an email from a photography magazine editor. She wanted to feature my work in an upcoming issue about supernatural photography. Attached were a dozen of my images I'd deleted, that shouldn't have existed anywhere. Every single photograph showed the entities more clearly than ever before. They were no longer hiding in shadows or disguising themselves as natural features. They stood prominently in each frame, posed like professional models, looking directly at the camera with expressions of satisfaction. The child figure from Grand Lake Lodge was in the foreground of every image, still holding my business card. But now I could read what was written on the back of the card in her small, precise handwriting. "Thank you for the introductions. We're ready for our close-ups now." The magazine published the feature without my permission. My photographs, showcasing entities that should never have been documented, were distributed to thousands of readers, photography enthusiasts, aspiring wildlife photographers, people who would look at my images and then visit these locations with their own cameras. I stopped taking pictures entirely, but it doesn't matter anymore because other photographers have started capturing similar figures. The entities have learned to pose for any camera, to inhabit any image taken in wilderness areas. They're building a visual network, using photography as a bridge between the wild places where they originate and the human world where images are shared, printed, and displayed. Listen carefully. If you take photographs in wild places and later notice figures in your images that you don't remember seeing, don't print those photographs. Don't share them online. Don't show them to anyone. Because some things that live in remote places have discovered that cameras can capture more than light. They can capture attention, intention, and invitation. And once you've photographed them clearly enough, once you've given them that level of documentation, they don't need the wilderness anymore. They have your images, and through your images, they have everything those images connect to.
My name is David Torres, and I've been coordinating search and rescue operations for Rocky Mountain National Park for 9 years. I've found lost hikers, recovered bodies from technical climbing accidents, and tracked down everyone from confused tourists to experienced mountaineers who made fatal mistakes in bad weather. I thought I understood the patterns of how people get lost in wilderness areas. I was wrong. What I discovered last summer taught me that some people who go missing aren't really lost. They're being used, and when they come back, they're not entirely themselves anymore. The pattern started in June with what seemed like a routine case. Kevin Walsh, 34, experienced backpacker from Fort Collins, had set out for a 3-day solo trip along the North Inlet Trail. When he didn't check out at the backcountry office on schedule, his wife contacted us. We found him 4 days later, walking along the Bear Lake Road at 6 a.m., wearing his full backpack and looking perfectly normal. No signs of exposure, dehydration, or injury. His gear was clean and properly packed. He appeared well rested and healthy, but Kevin had no memory of the previous 4 days. I remember setting up camp the first night near Cascade Falls, he told me during the debriefing. I made dinner, read for a while, went to sleep around 9. Next thing I knew, I was walking down the road toward the visitor center. It felt like I'd just woken up from the best sleep of my life. His story was consistent but incomplete. According to his wife, Kevin was normally a light sleeper who woke up multiple times during the night, especially when camping. The idea that he'd slept for 4 straight days without eating, drinking, or urinating was physiologically impossible. But the medical examination showed nothing wrong. Blood work normal, hydration levels good, no signs of head trauma or neurological impairment. Dr. Rodriguez, the park's medical officer, cleared him for release with instructions to see his personal physician if he experienced any further memory issues. I filed it as a routine case of altitude-related disorientation. Sometimes the combination of thin air, physical exertion, and unfamiliar surroundings can cause temporary confusion. Kevin had found his way back to safety, which was what mattered. 2 weeks later, Lisa Chen went missing under identical circumstances. Solo backpacker, experienced hiker, 3-day trip to Chasm Lake, failed to check out on schedule. Found walking along Trail Ridge Road at dawn, perfectly healthy but with no memory of the previous 5 days. Same story, remembered setting up camp the first night, going to sleep, then waking up on the road, heading back to civilization. Same medical results, completely healthy, well rested, no signs of dehydration or malnutrition, despite allegedly not eating for days. But Lisa had something Kevin hadn't, a GPS tracker. Her route data showed she'd hiked to Chasm Lake as planned on the first day. Then, instead of camping near the lake, her GPS showed movement throughout the night, not the random wandering pattern of someone who was lost or disoriented, but purposeful travel to specific locations throughout the park's backcountry. Over 5 nights, her tracker showed she'd covered over 60 miles of extremely difficult terrain, including areas that were officially off-limits due to wildlife closures and technical climbing hazards, routes that would have required specialized equipment and extensive local knowledge. Lisa was a strong hiker, but she wasn't a technical climber. She didn't have the gear or experience for the terrain her GPS showed her visiting, and she'd done it all while allegedly unconscious. By the end of July, we had 6 cases, all solo backpackers, all found walking along park roads at dawn, all missing 3 to 7 days with no memory of what happened, all showing GPS tracks that revealed impossible night journeys to remote areas of the park. I started correlating the GPS data from all 6 cases. What I found made my blood run cold. They hadn't been wandering randomly. Each missing hiker had visited the same specific locations, following routes that connected hidden caves, remote water sources, and areas where the park's wildlife monitoring equipment had been reporting unusual activity. It was as if something was using these hikers to conduct systematic reconnaissance of the park's most inaccessible areas. I submitted a report to my supervisor, recommending temporary closure of backcountry camping permits pending investigation. The request was denied. Summer season, David. We can't restrict camping based on a few cases of altitude sickness, but I knew this wasn't altitude sickness. On August 15th, I decided to investigate personally. I obtained a backcountry permit for the same area where Lisa Chen had started her trip, planning to camp at Chasm Lake and monitor the situation overnight. I set up my tent near the lake's eastern shore just before sunset. Standard camping protocol. Secure food in bear canisters, arrange gear for easy access, check weather conditions. I'd brought a night vision camera and motion sensors, intending to document any unusual activity. I also brought something the missing hikers hadn't: a climbing partner. Tom Bradley, one of our most experienced SAR technicians, agreed to take shifts keeping watch. If something was causing people to sleepwalk into dangerous terrain, we wanted to observe the process without becoming victims ourselves. The first few hours passed normally. Tom took the first watch while I slept fitfully in the tent. Mountain camping is never completely comfortable. The altitude, the cold, the sounds of wind and wildlife make deep sleep difficult. But around 2 a.m., something changed. I became aware that I was dreaming, but the dream felt more vivid and detailed than normal sleep experiences. I was walking along a trail I didn't recognize, moving with purpose towards some destination I couldn't see but somehow knew was important. In the dream, I wasn't alone. Other figures walked the same trail, all of us moving in the same direction with the same purposeful stride. I recognized some of them: Kevin Walsh, Lisa Chen, the other missing hikers. But there were dozens of others I didn't know, all walking together in perfect synchronization. We weren't controlling our movement. Something else was directing us, using our bodies like vehicles. I could feel its presence in my mind, ancient, patient, intensely curious about the physical world it was exploring through our eyes and hands. I tried to wake up, but the dream held me. The entity using my body was fascinated by the sensation of walking, of breathing, of experiencing the night air through human senses. It had been observing the park for a very long time, but only recently had it discovered how to temporarily inhabit human consciousness during sleep. In the dream, we reached our destination, a cave system I'd never seen before, hidden in a part of the park that didn't match any topographical maps I knew. The entrance was large enough for humans but clearly hadn't been formed by natural geological processes. Inside the cave, dozens more sleepwalkers stood in perfect rows, motionless but obviously alive. Their eyes were open but unfocused, and they breathed in perfect unison, as if controlled by a single consciousness. The entity was collecting them, using their dreams as a way to gather human subjects for some kind of long-term study. Each sleepwalker provided it with sensory data about the physical world, experiences it couldn't obtain any other way. I realized the entity was learning. Every night journey, every trek through difficult terrain, every interaction with park infrastructure was teaching it more about how to navigate and manipulate the physical environment. It was preparing for something. I forced myself awake and found Tom shaking my shoulder violently. "David, Jesus Christ, you were gone for 3 hours." I looked around confused. I was back in my sleeping bag, inside my tent. But my boots were muddy and my clothes were damp with dew. I was sleepwalking. You got up, packed your gear, and hiked straight up the side of Mount Lady Washington. I followed you with the night vision scope. You were moving like you'd done that route 100 times. No hesitation, no wrong turns, no need for a headlamp. You climbed sections that required technical gear using just your hands and feet. Tom showed me the footage from his night vision camera. The figure on the screen was definitely me, but I moved with an efficiency and confidence that was completely unlike my normal hiking style. No wasted motion, no pauses to check direction, no apparent concern for the dangerous exposure. How did I get back here? That's the weird part. You suddenly stopped about 200 feet from the summit, stood completely still for maybe 10 minutes, then turned around and came straight back, like someone had flipped a switch. I checked my GPS tracker. Tom was right. I'd covered nearly 6 miles of extremely difficult terrain in less than 3 hours, including technical climbing sections that normally would have taken me all day. But I remembered none of it. Just the vivid dream of walking with the other sleepwalkers toward the hidden cave. We packed up and hiked out immediately, but the experience had given me critical information about how the entity operated. It could only control people during deep sleep, and it seemed to have specific objectives for each nighttime expedition. I spent the next month analyzing GPS data from all the missing hiker cases, mapping the exact routes they'd taken during their unconscious journeys. The pattern was clear. The entity was using human bodies to systematically explore and document the park's infrastructure, wildlife patterns, and hidden areas. It was conducting reconnaissance, learning everything it could about Rocky Mountain National Park's layout, resources, and vulnerabilities. But the most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced the sleepwalker routes with recent changes in park wildlife behavior. Every area the possessed hikers had visited was now showing unusual animal activity, migration patterns disrupted, predator-prey relationships altered, species appearing in inappropriate habitats. The entity wasn't just studying the park, it was changing it, using the knowledge gained from its human reconnaissance missions to manipulate the ecosystem in ways I couldn't yet understand. In September, we had our first fatality. Mark Stevens, a 41-year-old engineer from Denver, was found at the bottom of a cliff near Long's Peak. Initial investigation suggested he'd fallen while attempting to climb a route well beyond his skill level. But his GPS data told a different story. Mark had made 3 previous visits to the same cliff face during sleepwalking episodes, each time getting closer to successfully completing the climb. The entity had been using his body to practice the route, learning the holds and moves through repetition. The final attempt, the one that killed him, showed Mark had actually made it to the top before falling, as if something had released control of his body at the moment of success, leaving his normal consciousness to wake up 30 feet above a deadly drop. I submitted an emergency report recommending immediate closure of all backcountry camping. This time, the request was approved, but it was too late. The sleepwalking cases had spread beyond Rocky Mountain National Park. Other parks in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana were reporting identical incidents. Missing hikers found days later with no memory of extensive night travel through dangerous terrain. The entity had learned enough about human physiology and park systems to expand its operations, and with each new sleepwalker it controlled, it gained more knowledge about how to manipulate both human consciousness and natural environments. I transferred to a different park system 6 months ago, but the sleepwalking incidents continue, and they're getting more sophisticated. The entity is no longer content with simple reconnaissance. It's building something, using human bodies as tools to modify wilderness areas in ways that serve its purposes rather than natural ecological balance. Pay attention to this warning. If you're camping in wilderness areas and you wake up feeling unusually rested but with muddy boots and no memory of the previous night, get to a hospital immediately. Have blood tests done. Check your GPS data. Look for unexplained physical fatigue or knowledge you didn't have before, because something that has been observing human behavior for a very long time has learned to use our sleep cycles as windows of opportunity. And once it's used your body to accomplish its goals, once you've served as its vehicle for exploring and modifying the physical world, you never sleep quite the same way again. Some dreams aren't dreams, some rest isn't restful, and some mornings you wake up knowing that you've been somewhere important, done something significant, but the memory belongs to someone else entirely.
My name is Dr. Rebecca Martinez, and I've been the chief geologist for Rocky Mountain National Park for 7 years. I have a PhD in structural geology from Colorado State, and I've mapped cave systems throughout the American West. I understand rock formations, mineral composition, and how underground spaces develop over geological time. At least, I thought I did. What I discovered in the cave systems beneath Rocky Mountain National Park taught me that some geological features aren't formed by natural processes. They're cultivated, and the things doing the cultivating have been at work much longer than humans have existed. The anomalies first came to my attention in late spring, when the park's hydrological survey team reported inconsistencies in groundwater flow patterns. Springs were appearing in locations where the underlying geology shouldn't support them, while established water sources were drying up without explanation. My initial assumption was seismic activity. The Colorado Rockies aren't as tectonically active as California, but we do get occasional shifts that can alter underground water flow. I requested funding for a comprehensive geological survey, focusing on cave systems that might have been affected by recent Earth movement. What I found instead were caves that were actively changing, not settling or slowly evolving over decades, changing day by day, as if something was continuously modifying their internal structure. The first clear evidence came from Lily Lake Cave, a small limestone cavern that had been thoroughly mapped in 1987 for the park's geological database. According to the original survey, it was a simple, linear cave, extending roughly 200 feet into the hillside, with 2 small chambers and no significant vertical development. When I resurveyed it in June, the cave extended over 800 feet, with 7 chambers connected by passages that curved and branched in ways that defied the local geology. I compared my measurements to the original survey data 3 times. The discrepancy wasn't a mapping error. The cave had genuinely grown, not through natural erosion, which would have taken thousands of years, but through deliberate excavation that had happened in the past 3 decades. The excavation work was remarkably sophisticated. The new passages followed natural fracture lines in the bedrock, and the chambers were positioned to take advantage of structural weak points. Whoever or whatever had done this work understood geology better than most professional engineers. But the strangest feature was the consistency of the modifications. Every new passage was exactly 7 feet high and 4 feet wide, dimensions that seemed designed for something specific to move through comfortably. Over the next month, I surveyed 12 other known cave systems in the park, Every single one showed similar expansion and modification. Passages had been extended, chambers enlarged, and new connections created between previously isolated cave networks. Someone was building something underground, a connected system of passages that spanned the entire park, linking cave systems that had never been naturally connected. I submitted my findings to the National Park Service's Geological Survey Division, recommending immediate investigation by a specialized cave mapping team. The response was bureaucratic deflection, budget constraints, personnel shortages, competing priorities, but I couldn't let it go. The engineering implications alone were staggering. The amount of rock that had been removed from these caves represented thousands of tons of material. Where had it gone? How had such extensive excavation been accomplished without heavy machinery, without anyone noticing the construction activity? In July, I decided to conduct a multi-day underground survey, camping inside the cave systems, to document any active modification work. I obtained permits for extended geological research and recruited 2 graduate students from Colorado State to assist with data collection. We started with the expanded Lily Lake Cave, setting up monitoring equipment to detect any seismic activity, temperature changes, or air pressure fluctuations that might indicate ongoing construction. The first night, we recorded nothing unusual. Standard cave environment, stable temperature around 45 degrees, high humidity, minimal air circulation. The only sounds were our own movements and the distant drip of water from limestone formations. But on the second night, we detected rhythmic vibrations coming from deeper in the cave system. Not random seismic activity, regular, purposeful impacts, like someone striking rock with heavy tools. The pattern was consistent: 3 sharp impacts, pause, 3 more impacts, longer pause, then repetition. I followed the sound deeper into the cave, beyond the areas I'd previously mapped. The passage continued much further than my initial survey had indicated, descending gradually through limestone formations that became increasingly elaborate and artificial looking. The walls showed clear tool marks, not the smooth erosion patterns of natural cave formation, but deliberate carved surfaces. The rock had been shaped with precision, creating passages that curved in, mathematically perfect arcs and chambers with acoustics that amplified sound in specific ways. After about half a mile of descent, I reached a chamber that wasn't on any geological map of the area. It was enormous, easily 200 feet across and 50 feet high, with a domed ceiling supported by naturally formed limestone columns. But the chamber wasn't empty. It was filled with machinery, not modern industrial equipment, but devices that looked like they'd been carved directly from the living rock. Massive stone wheels connected by intricate gear systems, all of it integrated so seamlessly with the cave's natural formations that it was impossible to tell where geology ended and engineering began. The machinery was in motion. The stone wheels turned slowly but steadily, powered by some mechanism I couldn't identify. The rhythmic impacts I'd been hearing came from a series of stone hammers that rose and fell in sequence, striking specific points on the chamber walls. Each impact sent fractures through the limestone in precisely controlled patterns. I watched in fascination as the hammers systematically weakened the rock along predetermined lines, while other mechanisms extracted the loosened material and carried it away through channels carved into the chamber floor. This was how the caves were being expanded, not by human workers, but by an automated system that had been running for decades, possibly centuries, continuously modifying and extending the underground network. But the most disturbing discovery was what the machinery was building toward. At the far end of the chamber, the stone mechanisms were constructing what could only be described as an assembly line. Raw limestone was being processed, shaped, and combined with other materials to create objects I couldn't immediately identify. The objects were roughly human-sized but clearly not human in design. They had the basic structure of bipedal forms, but with proportions that were wrong. Limbs too long, torso too narrow, head too large. They looked like crude sculptures of people made by someone who had observed humans but never been one. And they were moving, not with the fluid motion of living creatures, but with the mechanical precision of the stone machinery that had created them. They moved along tracks carved into the chamber floor, following predetermined paths that led to passages I hadn't explored. I realized I was looking at a manufacturing facility. Something was using the cave system as a workshop, creating artificial beings from processed stone and sending them out into the park for purposes I couldn't imagine. I started backing toward the passage I'd come from, but the sound of my movement caused the nearest stone figure to turn in my direction. Its head rotated with a grinding noise like millstones, and where its face should have been was a smooth surface with two deep holes that might have been eye sockets. It began moving toward me with that same mechanical precision, its stoned feet striking the chamber floor in rhythm with the hammers that continued their work on the walls. I ran. The passage back to the surface seemed much longer than it had during my descent. Behind me, I could hear the grinding sound of stoned feet on rock, moving with steady, unhurried pursuit. The thing wasn't fast, but it was relentless. I reached our base camp and gathered my equipment, shouting for my graduate students to pack up immediately. We had to get out of the cave before whatever I'd awakened reached the upper levels. But when we reached the cave entrance, it was blocked. Not by a rockfall or natural obstruction, by a perfectly fitted stone plug that sealed the opening as if it had grown from the surrounding rock face. The plug was warm to the touch and showed fresh tool marks around its edges. We were trapped. My students began to panic, but I forced myself to think systematically. If this was an engineered system, there had to be multiple access points. The connected cave network I discovered meant there were other entrances, other ways to reach the surface. Using my survey maps, I led us through passages I'd mapped earlier, looking for connections to other cave systems. The sound of stone footsteps followed us, always distant but never disappearing entirely. After 6 hours of underground travel, we found an exit through what had originally been mapped as a small, natural spring cave near Alberta Falls. The entrance was barely large enough to crawl through, but it led to the surface. We emerged just before dawn, covered in limestone dust and exhausted from the underground journey, but we were alive. I immediately filed an emergency report recommending closure of all known cave systems in the park, pending full geological and archaeological investigation. I included photographs of the stone machinery, detailed measurements of the modified passages, and samples of the artificially processed limestone. The report was classified, and I was transferred to a different park system within 2 weeks. But before I left, I conducted one final survey of surface features throughout Rocky Mountain National Park. What I found confirmed my worst fears about what the underground operation was actually producing. In remote areas throughout the park, I discovered stone formations that looked natural at first glance, but showed clear signs of artificial construction. Rock cairns, stone circles, and elaborate arrangements of boulders that were positioned with mathematical precision. They were waypoints, markers left by the stone figures to guide their movement through the park's surface areas. A navigation system that connected the underground manufacturing facility to specific locations above ground. The entities weren't just modifying caves, they were preparing the entire park for some kind of occupation, using stone constructions to mark territory, establish routes, and create infrastructure for purposes I could only speculate about. 6 months after my transfer, I received reports from colleagues still working in the area. Hikers were reporting encounters with rock formations that seemed to be watching them. Trail maintenance crews were finding their work mysteriously completed overnight, with stone repairs that were technically perfect, but used construction techniques no human workers would employ. And in the areas where I'd found the most sophisticated waypoint markers, wildlife was disappearing. Not killed or driven away, simply absent, as if the natural ecosystem was being systematically replaced by something else entirely. I've tried to warn other geologists about what I found in those caves, but the evidence has been classified, and my access to the area has been permanently revoked. All I can do is share this account and hope that someone with the authority to investigate will take the threat seriously. Listen to this warning carefully. If you're exploring caves in wilderness areas and you find passages that are too regular, too perfectly constructed to be natural, don't continue deeper underground. If you hear rhythmic impacts coming from within cave systems, don't investigate the source, because something that understands geology better than any human engineer has been modifying cave networks for centuries, building infrastructure for an occupation that may already be underway. And the stone figures it creates aren't just construction workers. They're the advanced scouts of something that views the surface world as territory to be claimed and reshaped according to its own purposes. The mountains themselves have been compromised, and what's emerging from beneath them has had a very long time to prepare.
My name is Michael Chen, and I've been the night security supervisor for Rocky Mountain National Park for 4 years. I patrol 415 square miles of wilderness from sunset to sunrise, monitoring facilities, checking on backcountry campers, and responding to emergency calls. I thought I knew what moved through these mountains after dark: elk, mountain lions, the occasional bear, and lost tourists who underestimated how quickly darkness falls at altitude. I was wrong. What I discovered during my night shifts taught me that when the sun goes down, Rocky Mountain National Park becomes something else entirely. Something that's been waiting patiently for humans to leave so it can get back to work. The first sign that something was different came during my 3rd month on the job. I was conducting a routine patrol along Trail Ridge Road around 2 a.m. when my radio started picking up transmissions that weren't coming from Park Dispatch. "Security Patrol, this is Baker Station, do you copy?" I grabbed my radio. "This is Chen, Night Security. Baker Station, I don't show you on my facility list. What's your location?" "Baker Station is... We're at the collection point. We need immediate assistance with overflow management." I checked my maps. There was no Baker Station anywhere in the park. I tried to raise dispatch to verify the transmission, but my radio only produced static. "Baker Station, please confirm your coordinates. I'm not showing any authorized facilities at your location. Collection point is running at 120% capacity. The water systems are backing up. We need security clearance to begin secondary protocols." The voice was professional, calm, but it was talking about infrastructure that didn't exist. I drove toward the coordinates the transmission seemed to be coming from, somewhere in the Moraine Park area, but found nothing except empty meadows and the normal sounds of night in the wilderness. When I returned to my patrol vehicle, the radio was silent. No further transmissions from Baker Station. Dispatch confirmed they hadn't received any unusual communications that night. I filed a report about possible radio interference from atmospheric conditions. But over the next few weeks, the phantom transmissions became more frequent and more disturbing. Echo Station to Night Patrol. We're showing multiple signatures in Glacier Gorge. Recommend immediate containment protocols. Echo. Water management to security. The collection chambers are at capacity, beginning redistribution to secondary sites. Photo archive to Night Command. New subjects have been cataloged, expanding coverage to adjacent grid sectors. Sleep Division reporting successful acquisitions. 17 subjects currently under management, requesting transport to primary facilities. Stoneworks to all stations. Construction Phase 7 is complete, beginning surface installations per schedule. The transmissions painted a picture of coordinated activity involving facilities and operations that shouldn't exist. but the locations they referenced matched exactly with areas where other park employees had reported unusual incidents, the drainage problems Jake Morrison had documented, the missing hikers David Torres had investigated, the modified cave systems Doc Martinez had discovered. Something was using those areas for active operations that ramped up dramatically after dark. I started documenting everything: radio frequencies, transmission times, coordinate references, terminology used in the communications. What emerged was evidence of a massive coordinated effort involving multiple groups working toward some common objective. But the most disturbing part was how professional it all sounded. These weren't random supernatural occurrences. They were organized operations with clear protocols, chain of command, and systematic procedures. Whatever was happening in Rocky Mountain National Park after dark was being managed with military-level precision. In October, I decided to investigate one of the referenced locations directly. The transmissions frequently mentioned primary collection activities in the Glacier Gorge area, so I planned a detailed overnight reconnaissance of that region. I parked my patrol vehicle at the Bear Lake trailhead just after sunset and began hiking toward Alberta Falls with full tactical gear: night vision, thermal imaging, emergency radio, GPS tracker. If there were really facilities operating in that area, I was going to document them. The first mile of trail was normal. Standard night sounds, normal temperature readings, no unusual activity. But as I approached the falls, my equipment started malfunctioning. The night vision flickered between normal operation and strange interference patterns. The thermal imaging showed heat signatures that moved in ways that didn't correspond to any wildlife I knew. And my GPS began showing locations that didn't match the trail I was actually hiking. According to the GPS, I was simultaneously on the Alberta Falls Trail and at coordinates that placed me underground in areas that should have been solid rock. That's when I heard the voices, not the phantom radio transmissions, but actual human voices calling from the canyon walls above the falls. The same phenomenon Marcus Chen had reported in his incident reports, people hearing their own voices calling from impossible locations. But these weren't random echo effects. The voices were having conversations. Acquisition team, what's your status on tonight's collection? We've got 7 subjects from the sleep division, all showing proper conditioning, ready for transport to Stoneworks. Confirmed. Water management reports the channels are clear. Begin moving subjects to primary facility. I was hearing the night shift operations in real time, not through radio interference, but through whatever acoustic tricks the entities in Glacier Gorge used to communicate across vast distances. I crept closer to the falls, using my night vision to scan the canyon walls. What I saw made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped my equipment. There were people on the cliff faces, dozens of them, standing on narrow ledges and impossible rock formations, all moving with the same purposeful coordination I'd heard in the radio transmissions. But they weren't really people. Through the night vision scope, I could see they had human shapes but wrong proportions. Too tall, limbs too long, movements too fluid. They were carrying objects I couldn't identify, passing them from ledge to ledge in a relay system that extended up the canyon walls and out of sight. These were the entities my colleagues had encountered: the echo thieves, the breath stealers, the water collectors, all working together in coordinated night operations. I followed their movement patterns with my scope, watching the relay system pass objects from the canyon toward what appeared to be a collection point near Mills Lake. The objects were roughly human-sized, wrapped in something that looked like organic material, cocoons. They were transporting people wrapped in cocoons. I recognized the movement patterns from David Torres's missing hiker reports. This was where the sleepwalkers ended up, not just being used for reconnaissance, but being collected and transported to whatever facilities these entities operated during their night shifts. I started backing away from the falls, but my movement triggered something. All the figures on the canyon walls turned in my direction simultaneously, their two long limbs adjusting position with mechanical precision. Then they started climbing down, not scrambling or rappelling like humans would, but flowing down the rock faces like liquid, maintaining impossible grip on vertical surfaces. They moved in complete silence, but I could feel their attention focused on me with predatory intensity. I ran. My night vision showed them pursuing through the forest around the trail, not following the established path, but moving directly through dense vegetation and over obstacles that should have been impassable. They were faster than any human, but they seemed to be hurting me rather than trying to catch me immediately. Driving me toward something, I broke through the tree line near Bear Lake and saw what they'd been guiding me toward. The lake shore was lined with more figures, the stone constructs Dr. Martinez had described, standing in perfect formation around the water's edge. But these weren't crude sculptures anymore. They'd been refined, improved, made more sophisticated. They looked almost human now, except for the way they moved, with perfect synchronization and the fact that their eyes reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors. In the center of the lake, something was rising from the water, not surfacing, rising, as if the lake bottom was being elevated by massive machinery underneath. As it broke the surface, I could see it was a structure of some kind, built from the same processed stone as the figures, but on a much larger scale. It was a building, or maybe a machine, something with clear architectural purpose, but designed according to principles I couldn't understand. Multiple levels, complex geometric patterns, surfaces that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I watched. And it was full of the cocoons I'd seen being transported through Glacier Gorge, hundreds of them, arranged in precise rows within the structure's chambers. Some were moving slightly, as if the things inside were still alive. Others hung motionless from frameworks that extended the building's walls. This was what all the night operations had been building toward. A collection and processing facility hidden beneath Bear Lake, rising to the surface only during coordinated night activities. The stone figures around the lake began moving toward me, still maintaining their formation, but closing the distance with mechanical precision. Behind me, I could hear the pursuit team from Glacier Gorge crashing through the forest. I was surrounded, but my radio suddenly crackled to life. "Night Patrol, this is Baker Station. We show you at the primary facility. Please maintain position for collection protocols." The voice was coming from one of the stone figures. Its mouth moved with the words, but the sound was broadcast from multiple sources around the lake, creating a surround sound effect that made it impossible to tell which entity was actually speaking. "You've seen our night operations," it continued. "You understand the scope of our project. We've been very patient, working around human activity, limiting our operations to avoid detection, but the project is entering its final phase." I raised my radio to respond, but realized it was pointless. They weren't communicating through radio frequencies. They were hijacking my equipment, using it as a speaker system. "Your colleagues have been very helpful," the voice said. "The Echo Thieves have mapped all acoustic properties of the park. The breath management system has tested atmospheric controls. Water collection has established fluid redistribution networks. Photo archival has documented all visual assets. Sleep Division has provided biological samples. Stoneworks has completed infrastructure development." The structure in the lake was continuing to rise, revealing more levels, more chambers filled with collected specimens. Some of the cocoons were opening, releasing figures that moved with the same mechanical precision as the stone constructs, but retained more human-like appearance. Rocky Mountain National Park has been selected as a processing center for this region, the voice continued. During daylight hours, it will continue to function as a human recreational facility. During night hours, it belongs to us. The infrastructure is complete. Collection operations are now entering production phase. I realized that everything my colleagues had encountered, all the supernatural incidents, the missing people, the modified infrastructure, had been preparation for this moment. The entities weren't just inhabiting the park, they were converting it into a facility for harvesting and processing humans. You have a choice, the voice said. Join the night shift as a voluntary participant, or become part of the collection inventory. Either way, you've seen too much to return to normal operations. The stone figures were close enough now that I could see the sophisticated craftsmanship that had gone into their construction. They weren't crude anymore. They were almost indistinguishable from humans, except for their perfect coordination and those mirror-bright eyes. I made my decision. I grabbed the emergency flare from my tactical vest and fired it directly into the lake, hoping to damage whatever machinery was raising the structure from the depths. The flare struck the building and exploded in brilliant red light. Immediately, every entity around the lake recoiled, their formation breaking as they retreated from the illumination. Light. They couldn't operate effectively in bright light. I fired my remaining flares in rapid succession, creating a perimeter of harsh red illumination around my position. The stone figures stopped advancing, and the structure in the lake began sinking back beneath the surface. But I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. I had maybe minutes before the flares burned out and the night operations resumed. I ran for my patrol vehicle, using my emergency spotlight to clear a path through the retreating entities. They didn't pursue. The light was too intense for them to approach, but I could see them regrouping at the edge of my illumination, waiting for the darkness to return. I made it to my truck and drove straight out of the park, using my emergency beacon to signal for backup that I knew wouldn't understand what they were responding to. I submitted my report the next morning, documenting everything I'd witnessed and recommending immediate investigation of night activities throughout the park. The report was classified, and I was reassigned to day shift operations pending psychological evaluation. But the night operations continue. Every evening after the last tourist leaves, Rocky Mountain National Park transforms into something else entirely. A processing facility operated by entities that have spent decades preparing the infrastructure for large-scale collection operations. The day shift employees, the rangers, maintenance workers, medical staff, they work in a park that's been fundamentally compromised. During daylight hours, it looks normal, functions normally, serves its recreational purpose for human visitors. But when darkness falls, the real owners take over. Here's what you need to understand. If you're camping or hiking in wilderness areas and you hear professional-sounding radio chatter that references facilities and operations that shouldn't exist, leave immediately. Don't investigate. Don't try to locate the source of the transmissions, because some places that appear to be protected wilderness during the day become something else entirely after dark, and the entities that run the night shift operations aren't interested in coexistence. They're interested in collection. The infrastructure is complete. The testing phase is over, and production operations are now running at full capacity, processing specimens collected from across the entire region. Sweet dreams.
My name is Dr. Amanda Foster, and I've been a park naturalist and wildlife biologist at Rocky Mountain National Park for 8 years. I've studied animal behavior patterns, migration routes, and ecosystem relationships throughout the Colorado Rockies. I thought I understood how predator-prey dynamics worked in wilderness environments. I was wrong. What I discovered this past year taught me that something has been systematically modifying the park's wildlife, turning natural animals into something far more dangerous. Creatures specifically designed to hunt humans, with intelligence and coordination that defies everything we know about animal cognition. The first anomaly appeared in April during routine wildlife monitoring. I was tracking a family of elk near Sprague Lake when I noticed behavioral patterns that didn't match anything in the scientific literature. Elk are prey animals. Their survival strategy is based on constant vigilance, group cohesion, and immediate flight response to potential threats. They're nervous, easily spooked, and maintain strict hierarchical structures within the herd. But this family was different. They showed no fear response to my presence, even when I approached within 20 feet. Instead of fleeing or displaying defensive postures, they seemed actively curious about me. The matriarch of the group positioned herself between me and the forest, effectively blocking my retreat route, while the other adults formed a loose semicircle around my position. It felt like being surrounded by predators, not herbivores. But the most disturbing behavior was their communication. Elk typically communicate through body language, scent marking, and occasional vocalizations. This group was making sounds I'd never heard from elk before, complex, modulated calls that seemed almost conversational, and they were imitating sounds from the surrounding environment. Bird calls, wind through pine needles, the splash of water from the nearby creek. Perfect acoustic mimicry that suggested cognitive abilities far beyond normal elk intelligence. I backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact as you would with aggressive predators. The elk followed, maintaining their formation, making those strange imitative sounds. They only stopped pursuing when I reached my vehicle in the parking area. I reported the incident as unusual wildlife behavior, possibly indicating disease transmission. But privately, I was disturbed by how coordinated and intelligent the elk had seemed. Their behavior suggested they were hunting me using sophisticated group tactics. Over the next month, I documented similar behavioral anomalies in multiple species throughout the park. Mountain goats that descended to inappropriate elevations and lingered near hiking trails, displaying none of their usual wariness of humans. Black bears that approached campsites not for food, but to observe human behavior with apparent scientific interest. Marmots that called to hikers using perfect imitations of human voices, luring people off established trails toward remote areas where other wildlife waited in coordinated ambush positions. But the most alarming discovery came in June, when I found evidence that these behavioral changes weren't learned adaptations. They were being caused by parasitic infection. I was conducting a routine wildlife health survey, collecting scat samples for disease monitoring, when I found specimens that contained biological material I couldn't identify. Microscopic examination revealed what looked like parasitic organisms, but unlike any species documented in the scientific literature, the parasites were highly complex, multicellular organisms with specialized structures that seemed designed to interface with nervous tissue. They showed clear evidence of artificial modification, genetic sequences that couldn't have evolved naturally, protein structures that suggested deliberate engineering. These weren't natural parasites. They were biological machines designed to modify animal behavior. I sent samples to the Colorado State University Veterinary Pathology Lab for independent analysis. The results were classified immediately, and my access to the lab was revoked pending security review of research protocols. But I continued my field observations, documenting the spread of modified behavior throughout the park's wildlife populations. What I found was evidence of systematic infection designed to turn the entire ecosystem into a coordinated hunting network. The parasites didn't just alter individual animal behavior, they created communication links between infected organisms. Animals from different species were coordinating their activities, sharing information, and working together in ways that violated every principle of natural animal behavior. Elk were serving as scouts, using their mobility and herd structure to monitor human activity throughout the park. Bears acted as mobile command posts, coordinating the activities of smaller infected animals within their territorial ranges. Mountain goats occupied high observation points, providing surveillance of trail systems and backcountry areas. Birds infected with the parasites served as rapid communication networks, carrying information between different areas of the park faster than any natural system could account for. The entire wildlife population was being converted into components of a distributed intelligence system designed to monitor, track, and capture human visitors. In July, I witnessed the system in active operation. I was conducting early morning observations near Bear Lake when I noticed unusual animal activity. Instead of the normal dawn feeding and territorial behaviors, every animal in the area seemed to be moving with unified purpose toward the same location. I followed at a distance, using binoculars to track the coordinated movement of elk, deer, marmots, pikas, and even several species of birds. They were all converging on a section of forest about half a mile from the lake, moving through the trees with perfect coordination, despite being species that would normally compete for resources or avoid each other entirely. When I reached the area they were heading toward, I found a family of tourists who had gotten separated from the main trail. A couple with 2 young children, obviously lost, and increasingly panicked as they tried to find their way back to the established hiking routes. The infected animals had surrounded them, not obviously threatening. The family hadn't realized they were in danger. The animals maintained positions that looked natural, like normal wildlife behavior. Elk grazing nearby, marmots sitting on rocks, birds perched in trees, but I could see the pattern. Every animal was positioned to block potential escape routes. They were herding the family deeper into the forest, using their presence to subtly guide the humans away from the trails and toward an area where the trees grew too dense for easy movement. I watched through my binoculars as the family responded exactly as the animals seemed to expect. When the children saw the friendly elk, they wanted to get closer. When the parents tried to head in one direction, marmots would suddenly appear in their path, causing them to change course. When they tried to call for help, birds overhead would make sounds that masked their voices. The animals were hunting them using psychological manipulation rather than direct attack. I intervened, approaching the family and offering to guide them back to the main trail. But as we walked, I could feel the infected animals tracking our movement. They maintained a loose perimeter around us, adjusting their positions to monitor our progress without seeming threatening. When we reached the Bear Lake parking area, every animal in the surveillance network melted back into the forest simultaneously, as if they'd received a coordinated stand-down order. The family never realized they'd been in danger. To them, it had been a delightful wildlife encounter, seeing elk and marmots up close, hearing beautiful bird songs, experiencing the magic of nature. They had no idea they'd been systematically herded by a coordinated hunting network that was only waiting for the right moment to complete the capture. I submitted an emergency report recommending immediate closure of all wildlife observation areas, pending investigation of possible rabies or chronic wasting disease outbreak. The recommendation was denied due to insufficient evidence of actual threat to public safety. But I knew the infected animals were becoming more sophisticated. They were learning from each encounter, refining their hunting strategies, becoming more effective at manipulating human behavior. In August, I discovered evidence that the parasites were creating hybrid organisms. I found a carcass near Lily Lake that appeared to be an elk at first glance, but anatomical examination revealed modifications that shouldn't exist. The brain cavity was enlarged to accommodate neural tissue that showed clear signs of artificial enhancement. The vocal cords had been restructured to allow for complex sound production. The digestive system had been modified to process a much broader range of organic materials, including human tissue. This wasn't just behavioral modification anymore. The parasites were physically rebuilding their hosts, creating creatures that retained animal appearance but possessed enhanced intelligence, communication abilities, and dietary requirements that included human prey. The hybrid organisms were the next phase of the infection process, animals that had been completely reconstructed to serve as specialized hunting units, designed to be more effective at capturing and processing human victims. I started finding evidence of these hybrids throughout the park. Bears with enlarged skulls and modified forepaws that showed tool use adaptations. Mountain goats with enhanced musculature and skeletal modifications that allowed them to move through terrain no natural animal could navigate. And all of them showing neural structures that suggested collective intelligence. They weren't just individual predators. They were components of a distributed hunting system that could coordinate activities across the entire park. The final confirmation came in September, when I found human remains in a location that should have been impossible for normal wildlife to access. The victim was a solo hiker who had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier, but the body wasn't in condition consistent with normal predation. The remains showed clear evidence of systematic processing, organs removed with surgical precision, bones cleaned with mechanical efficiency, everything arranged in a pattern that suggested ritual or scientific purpose, rather than feeding behavior. The hybrid organisms weren't just hunting humans. They were studying us, learning about human anatomy, physiology, and behavior patterns in preparation for something larger. I collected tissue samples from the site and attempted to have them analyzed independently, but every laboratory I contacted was either unavailable or claimed the samples were contaminated beyond useful analysis. The parasitic infection had spread beyond the park's wildlife. It was affecting the human infrastructure, the scientific institutions, the communication networks that should have been investigating and containing the outbreak. I realized that Rocky Mountain National Park wasn't just a breeding ground for modified wildlife. It was a testing facility for biological weapons designed to infiltrate and compromise entire ecosystems. The entities running the night operations that Michael Chen had documented weren't just collecting humans. They were perfecting biological warfare systems that could be deployed to convert any wilderness area into a coordinated hunting network. I submitted my final report in October, documenting the complete scope of the parasitic infection and recommending immediate evacuation of all human personnel from the park. The report was classified, and I was placed on administrative leave, pending psychological evaluation and security review. But the infection continues to spread. Reports of unusual wildlife behavior are coming in from other national parks throughout Colorado and Wyoming. Animals showing enhanced intelligence, coordinated hunting behaviors, and modifications that suggest parasitic infection. The breeding ground phase is complete. The biological weapons have been tested and proven effective. Now they're being deployed to convert the entire regional ecosystem into a coordinated hunting network. Here's what you must understand. If you encounter wildlife that seems unusually friendly, curious, or intelligent, don't approach them. If animals appear to be working together in ways that seem coordinated or purposeful, leave the area immediately. If you hear animal sounds that seem too perfect, too imitative of human voices or environmental noises, assume you're being hunted, because the things that look like natural wildlife in wilderness areas have been systematically modified to hunt humans with intelligence and coordination that no natural animal possesses. They're not just predators anymore. They're biological weapons designed to study, capture, and process human specimens for purposes that become more disturbing with every phase of their development. The breeding ground has produced its first generation of hybrid hunters, and they're ready to expand their territory beyond the boundaries of any single park.
My name is Professor Robert Whitehorse, and I've been an archaeological consultant, specializing in pre-Columbian Rocky Mountain cultures for 23 years. I've excavated sites throughout Colorado, studied ancient settlement patterns, and documented the sophisticated civilizations that thrived in these mountains long before European contact. I thought I understood the deep history of this region. I was wrong. What I discovered in the hidden archaeological sites of Rocky Mountain National Park taught me that the current supernatural activity isn't an invasion, it's a homecoming. And the entities reclaiming the park have been waiting patiently for over 1,000 years to complete a project that human settlement interrupted. I was brought in as a consultant in November after park officials became concerned about historical preservation issues related to ongoing infrastructure problems. My official mandate was to conduct an archaeological impact assessment for proposed facility modifications. But the real reason for my involvement became clear when I was shown classified reports from multiple park employees describing coordinated supernatural activity. The Park Service needed to understand whether the current situation had historical precedent. They wanted to know if ancient peoples had encountered similar phenomena and whether archaeological evidence might provide insight into how to address the ongoing crisis. What I found in my research was far more disturbing than anyone anticipated. The first clue came from tribal oral histories that had never been included in official park documentation. Working with elders from several regional tribes, I discovered consistent references to the sleepers of the high places, entities that had ruled the mountains before human habitation but had been forced into dormancy by some ancient catastrophe. According to these accounts, the sleepers weren't supernatural beings in the traditional sense. They were the original intelligent inhabitants of the region, a highly advanced civilization that had existed in the mountains for millennia before humans arrived. But something had happened to them, some kind of environmental disaster or cosmic event that had forced them to retreat underground into caves and hidden chambers where they entered a state of suspended animation while their civilization crumbled above ground. The oral histories described them as patient beyond measure and builders of systems that endure. They were said to be waiting for conditions to become favorable for their return to active habitation of their ancestral territory. The tribal accounts matched perfectly with the systematic, coordinated nature of the supernatural activity that current park employees had documented. These weren't random hauntings. They were the methodical efforts of an advanced civilization to re-establish control over territory they'd never actually abandoned. I requested access to all archaeological sites within park boundaries to look for physical evidence supporting the oral histories. What I found was proof that official archaeological surveys had missed or deliberately overlooked the most significant discoveries. Hidden throughout the park were ruins of structures that predated any known human civilization in North America by thousands of years. Not primitive shelters or hunting camps, but sophisticated installations built with engineering principles that contemporary technology could barely match. Near what is now the Alpine Visitor Center, I found foundations of buildings constructed from perfectly fitted stone blocks, each weighing several tons, arranged in complex geometric patterns that served purposes I couldn't immediately understand. The construction showed clear evidence of advanced mathematics, astronomy, and engineering knowledge. But the most revealing discovery was that these ancient structures corresponded exactly with the locations where current supernatural activity was most concentrated. The echo manipulation in Glacier Gorge was centered around ruins of what appeared to be acoustic engineering installations, chambers carved into rock faces with precisely calculated dimensions designed to amplify and direct sound across vast distances. The breathing anomalies on Trail Ridge Road occurred at sites where ancient structures had been built to monitor and control atmospheric conditions. The ruins showed evidence of sophisticated climate manipulation technology that used natural air currents and pressure systems to create localized weather effects. The water collection systems that Jake Morrison had discovered were built into infrastructure that was thousands of years old. The mysterious underground channels and collection chambers weren't recent constructions. They were ancient installations that had been dormant for centuries, but were now being reactivated. Every supernatural phenomenon reported by park employees was actually the reactivation of ancient technology that had been built by the original inhabitants before their forced retreat underground. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found evidence of what had caused their civilization to go dormant in the first place. Deep in the cave systems that Dr. Martinez had documented, I found chambers that contained detailed records carved into stone walls, not primitive pictographs, but sophisticated technical documentation that took months to decipher. The records described a civilization that had achieved remarkable integration with natural systems. They had learned to use living biological networks, animals, plants, even geological processes as components of their technology. Their entire society was based on symbiotic relationships with the environment rather than domination of it. But their technological advancement had attracted attention from something hostile. The records described invaders from the surface who brought mind poison that breaks the connection between thought and stone, between intention and growth. The invaders were humans, specifically humans carrying pathogens that the original inhabitants had no immunity against. Not just diseases, but something deeper, a form of psychic contamination that disrupted their ability to interface with the biological and geological systems that their entire civilization depended on. As human populations spread throughout the region, the original inhabitants found their technology failing. Their connection to the environmental networks that powered their society was being severed by proximity to human consciousness. Faced with the choice between extinction and dormancy, they chose to retreat. They sealed themselves in underground chambers, put their bodies into suspended animation, and waited for the human contamination to fade from their territory. But they left their automated systems running. The installations that controlled sound, air, water, geological processes, and biological networks continued operating in reduced capacity, maintaining the infrastructure for their eventual return. The recent supernatural activity wasn't new phenomena. It was ancient technology coming back online as the original inhabitants began to wake up. I found evidence of the awakening process in the deepest chambers of the cave systems. Hibernation pods constructed from materials that combined stone, metal, and organic components in ways that shouldn't be possible. Most were still sealed, but several had been opened recently. The beings that had emerged weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. The hibernation pods contained perfectly preserved bodies that showed clear evolutionary relationship to both human and animal forms, but with modifications that suggested thousands of years of deliberate biological engineering. They were the original inhabitants, awakening after centuries of dormancy to find their territory occupied by the same species that had forced them underground. But they were no longer interested in coexistence. The carved records made their intentions clear. The current supernatural activity, the echo thieves, breath stealers, water collectors, frame parasites, sleep control, stone manipulation, night operations, and biological warfare, were all components of a systematic reclamation project. They were methodically removing human presence from their ancestral territory using the same integrated biological and technological systems that had sustained their civilization for millennia before human contact. The missing hikers, the modified wildlife, the infrastructure changes. These weren't random, supernatural encounters. They were the deliberate actions of an advanced civilization reclaiming their homeland from what they considered an invasive species, and the process was accelerating. My analysis of the reactivation timeline showed that more hibernation chambers were opening each month. The original inhabitants were emerging in increasing numbers, bringing their ancient installations back to full operational capacity. The supernatural activity that park employees had documented was just the beginning. As more of the original inhabitants awakened, their technological systems would become more sophisticated, more coordinated, more effective at eliminating human presence from the region. I submitted my findings with recommendations for immediate evacuation of all human personnel from Rocky Mountain National Park and establishment of a permanent exclusion zone around the area. The report was classified, and I was informed that my consulting contract had been terminated due to budget constraints. But the awakening continues. The original inhabitants are systematically re-establishing control over territory they never legally or spiritually relinquished. From their perspective, humans are trespassers who have overstayed their welcome by several centuries. The biological warfare systems described by Dr. Foster are being refined and expanded. The coordinated night operations that Michael Chen witnessed are becoming more frequent and more sophisticated. Every week, more hibernation chambers open, and more ancient installations come back online. Rocky Mountain National Park was never meant to be a recreational area for humans. It was the technological and cultural center of a civilization that achieved harmony with natural systems in ways that contemporary science can barely comprehend. And now they want it back. I've tried to warn officials at other national parks throughout the region, but the evidence has been suppressed, and my access to archaeological sites has been permanently revoked. All I can do is share this account and hope that someone will understand the scope of what's actually happening. This is not a supernatural phenomenon that can be investigated, contained, or explained away. This is territorial reclamation by the original owners of the land. They have legal, historical, and technological precedents that makes human claims to the area meaningless. They built their civilization in these mountains over thousands of years. They developed technology that worked in harmony with geological and biological systems rather than against them. They were forced underground by human expansion and disease, but they never abandoned their territory. Now they're awake. They're reclaiming their ancestral homeland, and they have the technological capability to systematically remove any species they consider invasive. Listen to this warning. Rocky Mountain National Park is not abandoned wilderness that humans discovered and decided to protect. It is occupied territory belonging to a civilization that has been dormant but never extinct. They are reclaiming their homeland using methods that are beyond current human understanding, but perfectly logical from their perspective. Stay away from the park. Stay away from the entire region, because what's happening there isn't supernatural. It's the return of the original inhabitants to a territory that was always theirs, and they have no intention of sharing it with the species that drove them underground. My name is James Rodriguez, and I was the superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park for 6 years. I oversaw 415 square miles of protected wilderness, managed a staff of over 200 employees, and was responsible for the safety of nearly 5 million annual visitors. I thought I was managing a national park. I was wrong. What I discovered during my final week in that position taught me that I had been serving as the unwitting caretaker of an ancient civilization's homeland while they prepared to reclaim it. And when they decided the preparation phase was complete, they gave me a front row seat to watch everything I'd worked to protect transform into something that was never meant for human eyes. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in December when every electronic system in the park simultaneously malfunctioned. Not random equipment failures, coordinated shutdown of communications, monitoring systems, and emergency equipment across all facilities. Within 6 hours, I'd lost contact with every ranger station, visitor center, and maintenance facility in the park. Backup communication systems failed immediately after activation. Satellite uplinks went dead. Even cell phone coverage disappeared throughout the entire region. My emergency management training told me we were dealing with either a massive solar storm or some kind of electromagnetic attack. I activated the park's disaster response protocols and requested immediate assistance from Federal Emergency Management, but no help came. The outside world couldn't see into Rocky Mountain National Park anymore. From their perspective, everything appeared normal. Weather monitoring stations showed standard readings, satellite imagery revealed nothing unusual. Automated systems continued transmitting routine data. Something was generating a perfect illusion of normal operations while systematically isolating the park from external oversight. I gathered my remaining staff at the main administration building. 12 people who had been on duty when the communication blackout began. Everyone else had either been evacuated by the automated emergency systems or had simply vanished during the first hours of the crisis. That's when I started receiving the reports that made me realize we weren't dealing with equipment malfunction. Sarah Kim, one of our wildlife photographers, had been in the field when the systems failed. She made it back to headquarters with footage that showed animals throughout the park moving in perfect coordination towards specific locations, not fleeing from some disaster, assembling thousands of animals from dozens of species, all moving with unified purpose toward predetermined gathering points. "They're not scared," she reported, her hands shaking as she showed me the footage. "They're reporting for duty, like they've been waiting for orders their entire lives." Michael Chen, our night security supervisor, had been monitoring the situation from multiple vantage points throughout the park. His report was even more disturbing. "The landscape is changing," he said, spreading maps across my desk. "Not slowly, minute by minute. Rock formations are shifting position, trees are moving, water features are redirecting themselves. It's like the entire park is rearranging itself according to some blueprint we've never seen." Dr. Martinez, our staff geologist, confirmed the geological changes through seismic monitoring equipment that was still functioning. Every cave system in the park is being connected through new passages that are opening faster than natural erosion could account for. We're looking at active terraforming on a massive scale. But the most disturbing report came from David Torres, our search and rescue coordinator. He'd been tracking the fate of visitors who had been in the park when the crisis began. "They're not dead," he said quietly, "but they're not themselves anymore. I found families of tourists near Bear Lake, and they're just standing there, perfectly still, breathing in unison. Their eyes are open, but they don't respond to voices or physical contact. They're like biological statues." I realized we were witnessing the final phase of something that had been building for months. All the strange incidents my staff had reported throughout the year, the supernatural encounters, the infrastructure modifications, the unusual wildlife behavior, had been preparation for this moment. Rocky Mountain National Park was being actively reclaimed by its original owners. As superintendent, I had access to classified reports that hadn't been shared with my staff. Archaeological surveys suggesting ancient civilizations, biological analysis revealing parasitic organisms designed to modify behavior, geological studies documenting underground facilities that shouldn't exist. The federal agencies that oversaw our operations had known something was happening in the park, but they had chosen to monitor rather than intervene. Now their monitoring stations were blind, their communication networks severed, and their administrative oversight eliminated. We were on our own. On the second day of the crisis, I decided to conduct a personal survey of the situation. If I was going to file reports that would explain the complete loss of a national park, I needed to document what was actually happening. I took a Park Service vehicle and drove along Trail Ridge Road toward the Alpine Visitor Center. What I saw during that drive convinced me that Rocky Mountain National Park no longer existed as a location, meant for human habitation. The road itself was changing as I drove, not blocked by debris or damaged by weather, actively reconfiguring. Sections that had been straight for decades now curved in mathematically perfect spirals. Elevation changes that had followed, natural topography, were being replaced by engineered grades that served some other purpose. The landscape on both sides of the road was transforming. Rock formations were repositioning themselves into geometric patterns that looked more like architecture than geology. Trees were rearranging into precise formations that created sight lines and cleared pathways according to some systematic plan. And everywhere I looked, the infected animals that Dr. Foster had documented were working in coordinated teams to accelerate the transformation process. Bears were moving boulders with strength that exceeded their natural capabilities. Elk were using their antlers to modify tree arrangements with surgical precision. Mountain goats were working at elevations and on rock faces that should have been impossible for them to navigate, placing stone markers in specific locations. But the most disturbing sight was the humans. Scattered throughout the transforming landscape were visitors who had been in the park when the reclamation began. Hikers, photographers, families with children, all standing motionless in predetermined positions like biological monuments. They weren't dead. I could see them breathing, see their eyes tracking movement, but they showed no recognition when I called to them, no response to attempts at physical contact. They had been converted into living components of whatever system the original inhabitants were constructing. When I reached the Alpine Visitor Center, I found the source of the coordinated activity. The building had been completely transformed. What had been a modern facility designed for tourist education was now something that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of stone. The walls pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, and the air hummed with energy that made my teeth ache. Inside, I found them. The original inhabitants were no longer hiding in underground chambers. They had emerged in full force, dozens of beings that combined human and animal characteristics in ways that suggested thousands of years of deliberate biological engineering. They were tall, maybe 8 feet on average, with elongated limbs and enlarged skulls that suggested enhanced cognitive capacity. Their skin had a texture that looked like living stone, and their eyes reflected light with the same mirror brightness I'd seen in the hybrid animals. But the most remarkable thing was how obviously intelligent they were. These weren't primitive creatures or supernatural entities. They were representatives of an advanced civilization that was systematically reclaiming territory they had never legally relinquished. One of them approached me, the apparent leader, based on the deference shown by the others. When it spoke, its voice resonated through the transformed building with perfect acoustics. "Superintendent Rodriguez," it said, using my name and title with casual familiarity. "We have been monitoring your administrative efforts during our awakening process. Your dedication to preserving our homeland during our dormancy period has been noted." The being gestured toward wall displays that showed real-time data from throughout the park. Every location, every facility, every remaining human was being tracked with technological sophistication that made our monitoring systems look primitive. "The reclamation project is entering its completion phase," it continued. "Your species' occupation of our territory is being terminated. However, your personal efforts to maintain the integrity of our homeland during our absence qualifies you for continued existence. If you choose to accept modified status." I realized they were offering me the same fate as the motionless humans I'd seen throughout the park. Biological preservation as a component of their transformed ecosystem. "What happened to my staff?" I asked. "What happened to the visitors?" "They are being preserved according to their value to the restored ecosystem," the being replied. "Some have been selected for biological integration. Others serve as environmental monitoring stations. A few have been archived for future study. None have been wasted. Through the transformed building's windows, I could see the final phase of the reclamation process beginning. Every system that park employees had encountered individually, the echo manipulation, atmospheric control, water management, photographic parasites, sleep consciousness modification, geological restructuring, coordinated night operations, and biological warfare, was activating simultaneously across the entire park. The sky above Rocky Mountain National Park was changing color as ancient atmospheric control systems came fully online. The mountain peaks were shifting position as geological engineering installations activated. The forests were rearranging themselves as biological networks responded to commands that had been dormant for centuries. "Your national park designation expires today," the being informed me. "This territory returns to its rightful owners. Your governmental systems will record the area as experiencing temporary closure due to infrastructure maintenance. Their monitoring equipment will show normal operations continuing indefinitely." I watched through the displays as the illusion systems activated. To external observers, Rocky Mountain National Park would appear to be functioning normally for years, possibly decades. Satellite imagery would show standard seasonal changes. Monitoring stations would report routine data. Administrative systems would generate normal operational reports. But the actual territory would belong to the original inhabitants, restored to its function as the technological and cultural center of a civilization that had achieved integration with natural systems in ways that human science couldn't comprehend. "The modification process is painless," the being explained as other members of its species approached, carrying organic-looking restraints. "You will retain consciousness and memory, but your biological systems will be optimized for the restored ecosystem. You will serve as a cultural liaison, helping us understand the administrative methods your species used during the occupation period." I had a choice: accept biological modification and continue existing as a component of their restored civilization, or refuse and be archived as a historical specimen. I chose a third option. I activated the emergency transponder in my jacket, a device designed to signal for evacuation assistance in catastrophic emergencies. But instead of calling for rescue, I used it to transmit everything I had witnessed on every emergency frequency I could access. The transmission lasted maybe 30 seconds before the original inhabitants' communication suppression systems blocked it. But 30 seconds was enough to get my testimony into federal emergency response networks. Not that it mattered for immediate rescue. By the time my transmission was received and analyzed, Rocky Mountain National Park had been completely transformed into something that no human agency would be able to understand or reclaim. But my warning is now part of the official record. Somewhere in classified federal archives is documentation of what actually happened to Rocky Mountain National Park during the final week of December. The original inhabitants allowed me to leave, possibly because they respected my choice to warn others rather than save myself. They transported me to the park boundary and released me with instructions never to return. When I looked back, Rocky Mountain National Park appeared completely normal. Beautiful mountain wilderness preserved for human enjoyment, exactly as it had always appeared to external observers. But I knew the truth. Behind the illusion, an ancient civilization had reclaimed their homeland and restored it to its original function as the technological center of a culture that viewed humans as a temporary invasive species. The park is still there on all the maps. It still appears in satellite imagery. Administrative systems still generate reports showing normal operations. Tourists planning visits still receive standard information about facilities and regulations. But Rocky Mountain National Park no longer exists as a place for human habitation. It belongs to its original owners now, and they have no intention of sharing it again. Take this warning seriously. If you have plans to visit Rocky Mountain National Park, cancel them. If you have family or friends who work there, don't try to contact them. If you receive communications that claim to be from park personnel, don't trust them, because what exists in that location now is not a national park. It's the restored homeland of a civilization that spent centuries sleeping underground while humans played at being stewards of territory that was never ours to manage. They're awake now. They've reclaimed their homeland, and they've made it very clear that the age of human occupation is permanently over. The only question is how many other national parks are actually the dormant homelands of civilizations that are beginning to wake up.